On this day, 17th of February, 1979, the Chinese attack Vietnam. The Chinese attack on Vietnam in 1979 was something that had been building for a while. Back in the day, when the communists first took control of China, they were very supportive of a communist movement in Vietnam. They supported communists against the French rulers and were very happy when the French were turfed out of the area. The Chinese and the Soviets continued to fund the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, and the North Vietnamese infiltration efforts in South Vietnam, their interference in and support for communists in Laos and in Cambodia. This was a very fruitful thing that the Chinese and the Soviets were involved in. It brought around the takeover of these three countries eventually by communist regimes. There was, however, a problem. In the late 50s and early 60s, after the death of Stalin, Mao began to look at the Soviets as not proper communists, especially after the denunciation of Stalin by Khrushchev in 1957. Bit by bit, Mao would consider himself to be the real top dog in this relationship. When Stalin had been alive, Mao had always deferred to Stalin as the great communist leader in the world. He idolized Stalin and wanted to be like him. In many ways, he was very successful. He killed far more people and created a system that was far more oppressive and long-lasting. Strangely enough, you'd think all the chaos that happened in China at Mao's instigation, that it would have fallen apart years ago. But no, it was Stalin's Soviet Union that first failed. Anyway, throughout the 60s, and especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Mao considered that Khrushchev had sold out to the capitalists, China and the Soviet Union bit by bit began to distance themselves. It almost ended up in war in the late 60s and could have become a nuclear conflict. But cooler heads did prevail, especially on the Soviet side. They were not as suicidal as, or stupid as Mao. But by the late 60s, the Soviets, the Chinese, truly were enemies. Got to the point where they didn't even have diplomatic relations. And that they didn't re-establish diplomatic relations until Gorbachev came to power. That's in the late 80s. So there was a good 20 years where they either had strained relations or no relations. So, even though they were basically beating the living whatever out of each other, and hundreds of soldiers were being killed on both sides on the Sino-Russian border, they still both supported the Vietnamese and the communist movements in Southeast Asia because they still wanted them to win. Once this war was over, you had a competition between China and the Soviet Union as to who would end up in whose camp. So Mao wanted, obviously, his neighbors, all of his neighbors, to be his. And his successors, Deng and the various others, wanted that as well. Problem was, not many of the neighbors actually wanted to be cozy with China. North Korea It's strange to say, but North Korea, during the time of Mao, actually looked sane compared to Mao's China. Mao's China was insane. North Korea had, up until the 70s, had an economy that was either larger or similar to South Korea. Their standard of living was, by a communist standard, okay. They got a lot of money and supplies from the Soviet Union. So the North Koreans were actually, by communist standards, not too bad. They were loopy, obviously. They were brutal. They were communist, so they're bound to be. But compared to Mao's China, they were not that bad. You could have a nice job. You could have a job. You could eat. You didn't have the Cultural Revolution madness going on a couple of miles up the road. North Korea did not want anything to do with Mao's China. And something very similar was happening with Vietnam. Vietnam had tolerated Chinese influence during the time when they'd been fighting the Americans and the French. They understood that they were the weaker one, they were at war, it was a crisis. This is the time when Chinese took the Paracel Islands in the South China Sea, which had been claimed by the French as part of French Indochina. The Vietnamese considered that claim from the French to be basis for their claim on those islands, but because they were fighting the Americans, they bit their tongue and let it go. The problem is all the neighbors of China are suspicious of China because throughout their histories, Korea and Vietnam especially have been repeatedly invaded, occupied, annexed, or they've been forced to pay tribute to the Chinese government. This is something that they both chafe at. North Korea right now is dependent on China, but I guarantee you they do not like it. The communists in North Vietnam were in a similar position, but once the war was out of the way, they had more wriggle room than they did during the war. One of the first things they did was very clearly side with the Soviets. It's much better to side with a power that's thousands of miles away from your home and has no chance or desire to occupy you, rather than the big neighbor next door who's run by lunatics and has a history of occupying, invading, and taxing your people. Ho Chi Minh, the great communist leader of North Vietnam, said famously, and I went to the Ho Chi Minh Museum and saw this myself, he said he would rather sniff French shit for a few years than eat Chinese shit for the rest of his life. That's what he said, because at the time the French were coming back. The French were reoccupying the country. His position was that he would rather negotiate with the French, because he realized the French were going to go home at some point. It was inevitable. Problem is, the Chinese are right there. They're always there. They'll never go away. China is a fact. So he would rather cooperate with the French to keep the Chinese out, rather than cooperate with the Chinese to get the French out. Now, in the end, he did actually cooperate with the Chinese to get the French out. This was in the period just after the Second World War, where the nationalist Chinese had occupied northern Vietnam, and the British had occupied southern Vietnam. And then they were waiting for the French to come back to reoccupy their country. So, at the time, Ho Chi Minh was of the opinion that it would be preferable to have the French back for a little while, get the Chinese out, and then we could have our independence. So, once the war was over with the Americans, in 1975, North and South Vietnam were united. Laos had become a communist state, and Cambodia had fallen under the rule of the Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot was very fond of Mao Zedong. He had visited China, as had the king of Cambodia, actually. That King Sihanouk, he was an odd fellow. Anyway, so we're going on 1976-77. Khmer Rouge, they've done the whole thing of making all the people from the cities go into the countryside. Killing fields, millions are starving or being killed, and Cambodia is being supported by the Chinese. At around this time, the Chinese, because of their split with the Soviets, start cozying up with the Americans. This is the whole beginning of relationship between China and the United States, where China would do all the cheap manufacturing, the United States would outsource everything, and together they could weaken the Soviet Union and perhaps bring down the Soviet Union, or at least isolate them and contain them. I suppose no one really thought that they would actually bring the Soviet Union down, but maybe there were some hopeful people. So, this is where a lot of modern day stuff comes in as well. But anyway, so Cambodia's there, Vietnam's there, Pol Pot, like Mao, is insane. Mao has died, Deng's taken over, he's now in charge of China, and he's pretty much continuing Mao's policies of being friendly to the United States, of supporting places like Cambodia and some other nut-job places, and opposing the Soviet Union. And then Pol Pot goes. Well, he doesn't just go automatically. I've talked about this before. He has been attacking Vietnamese for many months now. He's even occupied various islands. He's killed ethnic Vietnamese. He's on a genocidal rampage at this point. He's even killed ethnic Chinese, and the Chinese don't seem to care that he's killing ethnic Chinese. So it's like, it just shows the bankruptcy of the Chinese regime. They don't care one bit. As long as you're on our side, you can do what you want. You want to kill someone? Okay, whatever. Pol Pot then attempts to invade South Vietnam. Now, at this point, got to realize it's only a few years since the North Vietnamese have occupied South Vietnam. There's this idea that they might be able to take it because Vietnam's weak. They attack South Vietnam. Problem is, the Vietnamese have a real army. They have weapons, they have tanks. They have decades of fighting experience, great generals, good intelligence. They have the support of the Soviet Union, which is far more militarily and technologically sophisticated than the Chinese, or definitely the Cambodians. The Cambodians have a half-starving army that's going in, and the other half are terrified that if they turn around they'll get shot. So it's an army that cannot fight. Pol Pot is insane. He thinks he can take this territory back, which used to be part of Cambodia about 2 centuries previously. He thinks he can get it back. It's not going to happen. The Vietnamese attack back. Within weeks, they destroyed Pol Pot's government, destroyed the Khmer Rouge as a fighting force. They're in the jungles near the Thai border. Because, guess what? Because America and China are friends, now America and the Khmer Rouge are friends. So the Americans hate the Vietnamese more than they do the idea of the Khmer Rouge doing what they were doing. So they're supporting, from Thailand, which is an American ally, over the border into the forested regions, the Khmer Rouge, to continue the fight against the Vietnamese. And the Americans start leaning on Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese, saying, look, what are you doing? We need to give the Khmer Rouge some room to fight back. You need to go in. You need to attack from the north. The Chinese are thinking this themselves. They're not, they don't have to be pushed. But the Americans want the Chinese to do this. Chinese want to save the Khmer Rouge. The Americans want the Chinese to save the Khmer Rouge. No one wants the Vietnamese to win except the Soviets. And so this is why the Chinese attacked Vietnam in 1979. They want to save Pol Pot and his government. The Americans want this as well. They want to humiliate Vietnam. And there's this idea they're going to take Hanoi in a few days, and the Vietnamese will have to withdraw from Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge will rush back in, take control again, and then they'll have that Sino-American puppet next to Vietnam to keep them in their place. This is the reason that the Chinese attacked Vietnam. So that Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot could come out of the jungles and retake control of Phnom Penh and Cambodia. The attack, when it came, was not a surprise. When Deng Xiaoping in 1975 visited the United States in January, he told the American president, Jimmy Carter, "The child is getting naughty," referring to Vietnam. It is time he got spanked. On the 15th of February, China announced that they would conduct a limited attack on Vietnam. Now, when they did this, the Soviet Union and Vietnam they had an agreement that they would both assist each other in case of attack. However, because the Soviet Union is so far away, there's not very much the Soviets could do. They did provide some support. They sent some tanks, they sent some weapons, some Soviet ships were off the coast protecting Vietnam, and they assisted in air support, so they were able to bring Vietnamese troops from Cambodia in South Vietnam to North Vietnam, nearer to the front. The Chinese, they had to station most of their army along their border with Mongolia and the Soviet Union, because they didn't know whether the Soviets would attack. The Americans intervened on behalf of China, because Deng Xiaoping said, or promised, and you can never really trust a Chinese communist, or any communist really, but especially a Chinese communist, and he stated that they would only be a limited incursion, and it was just to punish them and to help their allies, the Khmer Rouge. So the Soviet Union did stand down. Although Vietnam was an ally, it wasn't that important an ally. It was more of a propaganda thing. It was symbolic, because their great Vietnamese allies had defeated the great enemy of the United States. So that was the main reason, and so unless they were willing to go to war with China, there was not really much they could do. And going to war with China, well, that would have been a very serious war. So it was hoped, and it turned out to be the case, that it was in many ways a limited war. The Chinese had about 200,000 troops available for the Vietnamese theater. The Vietnamese had between 70 to 140, depending on who you believe, the Chinese or the Vietnamese. Obviously, the Vietnamese would understate their strength. The Chinese would overstate it, so let's say about 100,000. And then on this day, 17th of February, Chinese attacked into northern Vietnam. They attacked into a place called Lang Son, Dong Dang, Lao Gai, and Cao Bang. Now, these were not very far into Vietnam. They're about 10 to 15 miles-ish. And this is very mountainous territory. I remember crossing the border from China into Lao Gai and off down then to Hanoi. and it is very mountainous. So troops will have to be going through the passes and the river valleys. So you can imagine the Vietnamese being very good at guerrilla warfare. They're going to be in the mountains taking pot shots at these columns of Chinese troops marching in. There's no vast plain that they can spread out on. So they had some battles. They had some success, but it's agreed by many, including Americans who looked at this afterwards, that the Vietnamese were much better fighters in this war than the Chinese. The Chinese army, even now, is not the best. And the Vietnamese had 30 years of experience behind them at this point. They've been involved in proper battles, guerrilla warfare. They also had all that handy American war material they got when they conquered South Vietnam 4 years previously. So they were in many ways a very good position, and they were on the home field as well. The Chinese withdrew 10 days later. So, well, they stopped 10 days later. And in March, they finally declared that the Gate to Hanoi was open and the punitive mission was over and their aims had been achieved. And I think what happened was they realized that fighting in Vietnam was much harder than they thought it would be. They thought they could just march in. The Vietnamese were good fighters, and they killed the Vietnamese say they killed 40,000 Chinese. Probably an overstatement. Chinese say it's more like 5,000, so 10,000 maybe a bit more. So they did kill quite a few. And as I said, the territory is terrible, and they ended up having to withdraw. So it wasn't the best experience for China, and none of their aims were achieved. Cambodia continued to be occupied by Vietnam. Vietnam had not been humiliated or defeated. All they'd done is withdraw and allowed their local militias and guerrillas to fight the invading armies. There had been a few battles, and the Chinese had won and occupied a few towns, but they said that the gate to Hanoi was open and they withdraw. You would think that if the gate was open, why not push and open it? They didn't do that because I don't think that they actually won. I did meet a fellow in China once, and he was a little bit drunk, and apparently he said he was a soldier in the Chinese army, and he said that the Vietnamese had attacked China. They were trying to invade and conquer China in 1979. And I remember just thinking, okay, this is obviously the propaganda that they tell their soldiers, and the propaganda is they attacked us first, and then we pushed them back into Vietnam, because we're such a magnanimous country that we don't want to invade anywhere, we just want to get them out of our territory. So the story is that the Vietnamese invaded them first and were trying to conquer China. Vietnam, trying to conquer China. The country at the time had about 50-60 million people, trying to invade and conquer a country of about 800 million people. You can see why I probably didn't really believe him at the time. But that's apparently what the Chinese put about. That they were the victims of Vietnamese aggression. The effects of this war have been long-lasting. Vietnam and China continue to be adversaries, if not enemies, maybe, although many times they are enemies. And there's a lot of enmity between Vietnam and China. Obviously, the Chinese believe that they're completely blameless, and the Vietnamese are the aggressors, and they're terrible, and they're traitors and capitalist roaders, and all the rest. The Vietnamese don't like the Chinese because they're big, they're loud, they're brash, and they're domineering. And they tend to take things from them, like islands, and claim lands that aren't really theirs, but okay, it happens. Neighbors usually, especially with a big neighbor, usually tend to annoy the smaller neighbors. Okay, we get that. But throughout the 80s, Vietnam and China continued to have border skirmishes right up until the Vietnamese had actually withdrawn from Cambodia. The Chinese since then have gone back to Cambodia, not as Maoists necessarily, or as even communists, but as capitalists. Sihanoukville now is, I've heard, I haven't been to Sihanoukville, but I've heard from people who have, that it's like a Chinese colony there. There's lots of casinos, lots of businesses that are Chinese. The local Cambodians are, at best, the prostitutes and the servants, and the Chinese are the loud, brash, rich people who come to spend their money. The government in Cambodia there's been lots of scandals about how they're in the pockets of various wealthy Chinese businessmen and people connected to the Chinese Communist Party. And it did almost brought down a government in Cambodia, but Cambodian politics is not exactly the cleanest in the world, so I'm not up on modern Cambodian politics, so I'm not really sure what happened there. Vietnam has kind of retreated from its attempt to make Cambodia and Laos into its hinterland. Laos, it still has a lot of influence there. Laos still is a communist country, and although there's a lot of Chinese investment militarily in security reasons, Vietnam still has a lot of influence there. And from what I heard, there are still Vietnamese troops that are stationed in Laos. Also, in Laos, there's a lot of Vietnamese expats, lots of bakeries, cafes, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of economic influence that Vietnam has over Laos. Cambodia, it seems to be more in the Chinese camp. And Vietnam, I don't think is very happy about that. Because throughout the past few hundred years, even when it was ruled by the French, the Vietnamese very much were about securing that part of Indochina, to give Vietnam, that skinny little country on the coast, that at some points is only about 20 miles wide, needs more of a secure hinterland. A country like Laos with only 6 million people, in Cambodia with only 15, compared to 100 million in Vietnam. Vietnam needs to dominate those countries to be able to be effectively independent. And so when China is trying to nip at its heels, Vietnam gets defensive. The same thing has happened in the South China Sea, and, well, they're not the best of friends, let's say. But there is still, despite that, because they're neighbors, there is a lot of cross-border activity, economic activity. China and Vietnam have complemented each other for a long time, and now Vietnam, now that China is not as popular with the rest of the world as it used to be, Vietnam is trying to poach a lot of manufacturing and the expats to go to Vietnam. Vietnam has a strength that China doesn't. It's more open to the world. People are generally better educated. Their English level is better, and they're less unaware of what's going on outside of their country. It's much more open than China. And so I think Vietnam overall, despite being a bit late, seems to have done, I think long term will be better off than China. I think Vietnam, despite being late, despite being smaller, despite being poorer, will be like the tortoise, the one that wins the race. So on this day, China attacked Vietnam and thought it would be a cakewalk. It didn't prove to be that, and they kind of had to leave, pretending that they actually weren't leaving because they were being handed their arse to them. They were, oh no, we had to leave because, we'll a tea party up there, yeah. So on this day, the war began. It didn't last very long, and the Vietnamese pretty much once again won. If you like these videos, come back for more tomorrow. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment.